I was raised in the countryside. When I was a young child, I thought of it as a natural environment. I spent my formative years moving from one rural environment to another, and later understood that these landscapes, rather than being natural terrain, were perfectly manicured plantations, where varieties of sugarcane were carefully bred and planted in 5-foot by 5-foot plots in ploughed fields. 1,742 cane holes were planted per acre. There wasn't anything natural about the plantation. Since the early 17th century, this land has been deforested, mapped, farmed, and under surveillance as Britain's first sugar isle. Those actions, under the guise of empire, expansion, and progress, contributed to what is now understood as the birthplace of the Anthropocene or the Plantationocene, the era of environmental transformation and climate collapse. What was once understood as a passive space has transformed. The lands are now showing agency, rupture, and abundance. I try to listen to it with another ear, and I wonder if we listen to it more carefully, what we might hear and what we might learn about it and about ourselves. My work straddles biography and history, focusing on post-plantation economies by engaging with this particular landscape here in St. George, Barbados, where I've been located for the last 20 years. It was a former 17th century sugar plantation and converted to a dairy farm more than 35 years ago. I'm interested in drawing lines on paper, interfering with lines on ledger pages, forming lines that connect this time to that time. My practice recognizes the need to draw new lines, refusing to accept that all lines have already been drawn. The Wild Plant series acknowledges the agency of wild botanicals growing in former sugarcane fields. I once saw them as weeds, but I later understood their medicinal value. Grown and cared for by enslaved Africans, used in Afro-syncretic spiritual practices for healing, these plants shaped identity in slave societies. I now see these plants as active agents in the process of healing the soil, re-emerging centuries later to assert themselves against the backdrop of a dying sugar industry. When I walk the fields, I find porcelain and ceramic shards in the soil, which I've incorporated into the work called Bush Tea Services. And from this project, I have served bush tea made with cerci, lemongrass, blue vervain, and bay leaf, while engaging in dialogue about British-Barbadian historic relations. I was surprised when speaking with London-based participants by their lack of understanding regarding our shared history and how the landscape was transformed by the colonial project to modernize their society. How could they not recognize us after so many centuries of entanglement? Bush Tea Plots, a decolonial patch, is a permanent intervention located at the University of the West Indies in Barbados. It references small plots of land given to the enslaved people where they grew food and medicine, took care of themselves and of each other, becoming important sites of tradition, healing, and ritual. The plot was a creative pre-capitalist site located within the larger capitalist colonial machinery of the plantation. It resisted the dynamic of the plantation and became a space for the creative imaginary, the nurturing of spirit and of memory. My current commission is developing an apothecary at Walker's Reserve in St Andrew. It's located in the Scotland district. It's called the Garden of Hope, and it's located on what was the 17th century sugar plantation. It then converted about 50 years ago into another kind of extractive economy. It was a silica sand quarry, and that's now going through another transition to become a permaculture site. The Garden of Hope is dedicated to indentured women, invisible women who eked out a living in the harsh landscape of the Scotland district, as well as the women and girls who were listed in the 19th century slave registry for walkers. And that living apothecary is going to include plants that will focus on women's reproductive and post-reproductive health. It will have plants that will be used for a general first aid kit. And the apothecary will sit within the larger, hopeful vision of a post-plantation regenerative landscape. Okay, so I've called this a series of plots, and I'm thinking about the word both as like a verb and a noun. The enslaved and indentured were often given small plots of land within the context of the plantation, and I think of these plots as spaces where the enslaved and the indentured became human within that larger kind of trauma colonial project. There'll be some repetition of images from what you just saw, just to kind of reaffirm some of the work. This is where I live. The long roof to the right is the barn that houses the cows in the day, and the smaller roof to the left is my home, and just under to the left of that is where my studio is located. So when I look out of my studio window, I look on to the mill and the old sugar works building. And that mill is, this property began as a sugar plantation in 1667. The mills were a technology that Brazilian Jews brought to Barbados in 1654 when they were fleeing religious persecution there. And that's what sort of kickstarted what we call the sugar revolution. And the economy just kind of blew up because it became a more efficient way of producing cane. Barbados was at one point, I think I was sharing with someone, the richest spot of land on the earth, 21 by 14 miles. And I often think about Antonio Benitez Rojo. Yawo was speaking about infection. He's a Cuban essayist, and he wrote a critical book called The Repeating Islands. And he spoke about Caribbean history was akin to a long annelid parasite that was growing in the bowels of the region. And it's such an amazing statement to speak about that history of the plantation. So when the British arrived in 1627, there was they met a very biodiverse island. The Caribbean has a number of kind of biodiverse hotspots, but by the third quarter of the 17th century, that biodiversity was erased, and it basically became one very big plantation. So I see this every day, and it's impossible not to be reminded of this history. Am I using the right arrow or the down one? Yeah. I walk a lot. I see walking as a kind of, it's not just for exercise, but there's a kind of a ritual practice associated with walking. And through COVID, we all learned the word curtilage. So in Barbados, you had to stay within your curtilage. And I was very privileged because I had a 120-acre curtilage where the cows were. And so I was able to walk a lot. And that really saved my sanity through that period of extreme lockdown. But walking the land has become really important, and it informs a lot of the work that I'm doing. And it's a time for thinking and dreaming and imagining and processing. I often reference St. Augustine said, it is solved by walking. And I think if there's any challenge, that if you walk, you will sort it out. I'm really interested in substrates. These are plantation ledger pages. The British Empire used ledger pages globally. It's how they accounted for everything. And I was interested in, maybe 8 years ago, I found hundreds of ledger pages in an abandoned bookkeeper's house on the estate where I grew up, but we no longer lived there. And so I threw them out the window 2 stories down, put them in the car, and felt like I'd struck gold. And this was something that I needed to work with. And I'm interested in the ledger page because it suggests a certain level of order. These very neatly delineated rows and columns, but they really exclude so much information. And a lot of the history that we speak about is often through the economy of the sugar industry and the sugar plantation and the colonial project, but there's a lot of other information that's missing. And I had like the opposite upbringing of Yuri, because I didn't have parents that were doing like these very cool alternative things. My father was a planter. I was born on a plantation that was owned by the government that he managed. And then he acquired his own plantation. And I you know, I was kind of in the belly of the beast, I guess. And he used to remove weeds, either by labor or by chemicals. And he prided himself on a weed-free estate. It wasn't until I was much older that I understood in my impoverished education, which didn't speak about any of this, that these weeds had so much value. And so I was trying to do work that would begin to educate myself on the value of these plants, not only to biodiversity, but to the way in which enslaved Africans were able to take care of themselves, to build community, to develop bush tea, bush medicine, bush baths, and that they too should have a place in these ledger pages that would tell another story, offer another way of thinking about the history. After finding these plants growing after centuries of kind of being taken out, finding them growing in abandoned sugarcane fields because the industry is dying, the next step then was to think about making teas. And so I would harvest plants from the land where the dairy is now. And this piece was commissioned by Cooking Sections, and I took it to London as a kind of a mini act of reparation to serve not sweetened tea, which is the second most drunk beverage in the UK, but to serve this healing tea as a performative discursive project. And in the serving of the tea, it would leak. And so it would speak to the messiness of history, the gaps in history, the gaps in our knowledge. And it was here, you know, this is not that long ago, but I really never had an understanding that the average British person did not have a clue what I was talking about. And that's what I would say, but I've known you for 300 years. Why do you not know who I am? I don't understand. And it was all of the foreign people that came in on Baker Street in London that knew exactly what I was talking about. It was very bizarre. The last project in the video, that place is also called Walkers. So I'm raised on Walkers, and this other site is called Walkers because it was also acquired in the 18th century by a man called George Walker. So there's a strange synchronicity between the work I'm doing on the land where I live, where I squat. Actually, I don't own it, but I'm squatting there at the grace of my family. And this other Walkers. And here the substrate is kind of like the contour lines. Barbados has been mapped like many places for centuries, but the mapping, of course, is not neutral, and it's really done around ideas around extraction. What was the quality of the soil? Where could you plant different varieties of cane? So these are plants that have been growing within that site. So it's, again, a way of learning about the wild plants. Are these kind of, they're not drawing on the history of botanical illustrations and that kind of detailed drawing, but they're more kind of meditative drawings that are responding to the plants. And they sit on top of these contour lines as a way to say, we're important, even though we've been ignored for so long. My commission with the National Trust for Scotland, they have a project called Finding Our Past. No, I've just forgotten that. But it's an acknowledgement on the part of the National Trust that many of their properties in Scotland were funded by the transatlantic slave trade. And I had shown work at the Royal Botanical Gardens, Edinburgh, and they were interested in it. And so I've been working with them for almost a year. And there are several parts of the project. One is to work with a high school of crofting students. So crofters are like peasant farmers that worked in the Highlands, and through making this garden with the students, to use the plants to speak about a shared history and the way in which plants have been respected and revered in Gaelic history and Druid history, and then through that to speak about how plants have been used within the Caribbean and enslaved society. So the crofting students, it's an elective course in the school. They're 15, 16-year-old students, and they will continue to care for the garden. And the tea that you're drinking, which I made with Jeanette Taylor, who's a herbalist on the Isle of Skye, harvested these plants from the Balmacara estate and she will go back and teach the students how to harvest the plants and to make teas so that they have a kind of a more embodied understanding of the value of the plants. The reason we chose Balmacara Estate, which is in the Highlands, the Scottish Highlands, is because the owner of that estate was the governor of Barbados from 1800 to 1806. His name was Lord Seaforth. And he was one of the first people in the Caribbean to bring plants from the Caribbean to Kew Gardens. He was a natural history buff and an amateur botanist. So there was an obvious connection to working with this estate. But again, it was really interesting that no one there knew about the movement of Scottish indentured labour to Barbados. And this was information that was entirely foreign. Their curriculum around history is British history, and which tends to be more about English history. So in a way, we're able to, work in the garden and to speak about these shared histories through plants and their healing properties. The bush tea plot, which is at the University of the West Indies campus in Barbados, inspired by Sylvia Wynter, who's written about the plot as this pre-capitalist site within the larger capitalist machinery of the colonial project. And so this project was a kind of a vitrine that is showcasing the soil profile, the limestone. Barbados is a limestone island. And there are about 10 plants in here that then the QR code takes you back to a website called the Bush Tea Plots WordPress. And there's a sharing of research and information and writing. There's information about the plants that are included in the project. And as Yawo was saying earlier, there's this anxiety about erasure and loss of information and tradition and memory. So it's kind of honoring the use of these plants and trying to create open source information that people can freely access. And then there's a space in Derbyshire called Harlem Art Space Gallery in the belly of the Industrial Revolution in the north of England, who invited me then to do a bush tea plot for their site as part of a solo exhibition. And the brick building in the back houses the Harlem Art Space, but it was originally a cotton mill. And Barbados exported cotton in the mid 17th century to Britain. And so this bush tea plot was developed to use plants that could be used, would include plants that people that were working in the mill would have used for spinner's phthisis, bronchopulmonary illnesses. They were foraged. So this was through COVID. So I worked with a guerrilla gardener, and there was a small team of people that we collaborated on the selection. And it was, when you look at some footage of the cotton mills, you see the cotton falling like snow, which people were ingesting, and then they were developing spinner's phthisis. And when it was suggested that they would bring in fans to blow the cotton out, they said no, because it made them feel full. It was a way that they, felt satiated, which was, kind of. This is the Garden of Hope that's happening on the Walkers site in the Scotland district of Barbados. On the east coast of Barbados, there's an area called the Scotland district. When the indentured labourers came there, it looks very much like the Scotland district on a smaller scale, and so they named it that. And it's this transition from the sand quarry to this permaculture site with a small area of conservation. The building on the right is the new home of the Caribbean Permaculture Research Institute. And on just above where the solar panels are is where my very small garden will be going. So that's looking from the permaculture site. The land is currently being graded and beds will go in. So I've worked with Kevin Talma, whose works is doing like garden architectural design. So we have about 30 plants that are going in here, and the focus is on women's reproductive and post-reproductive health. So people that come in to do workshops and scientists will then have access to this as something to use for research and to have a closer understanding of the plants. This piece is currently being shown in Caracas in an exhibition there called Lines of Flight. The install image here was taken from the Kunsthalle Bratislava. It's actually an exhibition curated by Maha and Ruben Folks. They will be joining remotely later. But the question I had for this work was really about how can I form a more intimate relationship with a landscape that has been so heavily mediated by 4 centuries of colonization through first the sugarcane plantation and then now under tourism. And so the walking as ritual is a way that I have thought about forming a more intimate relation with the land. The drawings are done on daily analysis records, which are from an abandoned sugar factory lab. And rather than having this kind of scientific recording of what happened in the lab, the idea then was to walk the land and in a way just to respond to the space and to create these drawings on the daily analysis records. And then they sit on these contour lines, which are the contour lines of the space where I live and work. So it's these more subjective ways of looking at history. I'm interested in the character of the overseer. Maybe you know the overseer, who was very central in the colonial project. So he would oversee land and he would oversee labor. But I'm thinking in contradiction to that, this notion of inner seeing. So the overseeing is a very objective distance way of looking at a place, which I think facilitates more extractive relationships with a location. And the inner seeing is a very kind of subjective way of experiencing the landscape. And so I feel that this is a way of developing, you know, it's the breeze, the wind, the sounds, what you find. The shards come up a lot, like the small image with the blue on the right. Every day I walk, these shards are from the late 1700s, early 1800s. They came in as ballast on ships, and there are millions of these pieces all over the Caribbean. And the project that I'm working on now is for the Sharjah Biennial, which is opening in February of 2023. I've been offered a beautiful space called Beit Al Herma. It means the woman's house. And I'm calling the project A Tender Place of Kindness, a decolonial plot. And the idea is about, you know, people coming back into these large biennial projects with lots of people after the pandemic and maybe feeling a little anxiety about these large crowds. But I'm hoping that when people come into this space, there'll be a kind of a moment to pause, to have tea, and there'll be a garden. We're starting planting jasmine. The idea to have, you know, your sense of smell, that you will smell something when you come into the space. But what I'm looking at, and these are the jasmine plants that are under cover at the moment. The challenge here, of course, is that Sharjah goes up to over 50 degrees Celsius, and I don't have any experience with that. So it's just really trying to see what will survive. Here, I'm different to the little glass vitrines I've been working in. I'm looking at how the plot in the post-colonial, post-independent nation state has moved from within the confines of the plantation, and how many Barbadians, descendants of that of being enslaved, have moved that plot into the backyard of their home. The plantation is the practical application of geometry, right? So it's like the ledger pages. It's a very ordered space. As I mentioned in the video, it's 1,742 plants per acre of cane. So it's very, very ordered. But that plot within the plantation didn't conform to that sense of geometry. It was African traditions of planting. And in some cases, as I think I mentioned the other day, Jill Cassid writes about the grafting of that onto the kunoko. So this interplanting of flowering plants, of ground provisions, of fruiting trees like coconuts and banana trees, of herbs, of plants used for ritual and medicine, and using whatever materials you had at hand, but very densely organized because the spaces are often quite small. So working with galvanized sheets, paint buckets, whatever you have to hand. This is a garden made by a woman called Polly, who lives near to where I am located. And so I'm looking at these kind of patterns of gardening, and that will influence what happens in Sharjah. I've recently started doing these embroidery works and thinking about charms. And in my research in Scotland, I saw that the Gaelic practices included incantations and charms, but the enslaved society also used incantations and charms. And so building on that kind of inspiration of working with plant material as inspiration, as guidance, as healing, as medicine, as ritual, thinking more about these charms as kind of present day ecological charms, and looking at things that are found very commonly in our environment. So on the right is a piece of coral with a sea plant that has attached itself to it. And then again, the substrate, this inherited crochet, linen, tablecloths, little doilies, whatever, attaching these things that are very common in the landscape, but often overlooked, to say this is important. You know, let's look at these as our corals are completely bleached. Most of our reefs are dead. We have a huge cruise ship industry. You know, we put sewage out into the ocean. Yeah, so it's kind of taking these things up as relics. And on the left is a tea cloth with the lines, geological lines of the survey topographical maps, but cyanotypes of seaweed and different plants that are appliqued onto that. And then I've just come from an inaugural residency called Focus Foundation in Catalonia, and spent 4 weeks there thinking about the Sharjah Biennial, but then I wanted to ground myself in the location. So I would take breaks from doing the research and the writing, and I was collecting plants that grow on that estate. So it's a combination of things that are more indigenous to the region, but then as everywhere, they're plants that come from other places. But I also noticed when I walk in that there, as you have some of the tiles here in the kitchen, there were these absolutely beautiful hydraulic tiles, and they originate from the Catalonia region in the 1860s. And those hydraulic tiles were inspired by flora. And the house where I grew up, there were a few of these tiles, so I recognized them immediately. And I'm thinking a lot about how we look at nature and there's this urge to be creative and to be inspired. So I was interested in linking these hydraulic tiles that are made in cement with the plant material that was there. So there's fennel and Queen Anne's lace, St. John's wort, and I've forgotten the name of the last plant. So I did a series of 28 drawings when I was there. And now I've started, this is the last slide, working with embroidery. So on the inside of the small building in the Sharjah Biennial, I'm going to have a series of banners. And I thought, well, we're going to hell in a handbasket. Why not pray to flowers while we're on our way there? So I'm beginning to learn how to embroider. And Rosa, who is works at the Focus Residency as one of the janitor staff, had a bride dress making business which went under in COVID, and so she's now become a cleaning lady. So we were collaborating a little bit. So the idea is to make these long banners that, kind of like the garden, are very dense. This is just the very beginning, but they're very dense, so they speak to the density of this combination of plants. So there'll be this combination of crochet and things that came in from the UK to Barbados that have become part of the vernacular traditions by many Barbadian women, and to create a series of these tapestries, and really thinking about a space of beauty, of serving teas. We'll be activating that apothecary courtyard in Sharjah through a series of workshops that will be about tali, which is a disappearing embroidery technique that people in the Arab world use, making teas, focusing on women's sexual health, on reproductive and post-reproductive health, workshops using cyanotypes and kite making for children, thinking about composting, about growing plants. So yeah, these are just some of the projects I've been working on, but I wanted to focus on those connected to plants. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very, very much to share your work and your deep engagement with environment, with histories, with community, with questions of justice and climate change through your really central and embodied practices that take the form of healing, of various forms of healing actually. And maybe this is also, well, maybe first of all, we open up before. I have one question in mind, but first of all, I would like to see if there are already any questions in the digital audience or the physical audience.
Yes, this is an open question. I think maybe both of you can elaborate on this, but it's also a question for like maybe sparking a bit of speculation and reflection on this, which is something that struck me about what we just heard is this idea of being the plantations, one of the early sort of the places of birth of these systems that later we went on to benefit from, that later generated economy and the surplus to fund cultural institutions, to create the wealth that later somehow, either for guilt or philanthropy, got distributed and started institutions. But now we see with all the layers of complication and catastrophe that impacted your work, your institutional experiences in the Bahamas. So I wonder, how do you see this in a temporal large scale? Because yesterday we just had a brief conversation, and I just said that at times I find, in my case, South America, but I can be expanded to other locations that are somehow in the past, somehow not as central and developed as we might find, the global north. And I was just trying to argue against that. Say, I think they're caught up in a strange temporal scales where they are both in the past and in the future. They show us what has not worked before, but they're also resolving lots of things years ahead. So in that, I wanted to ask you, how do you articulate a bit this kind of twisted notion of past, future, this temporal?
Yeah, so the joke is that we have a third part, but we're out of time. And the third part, I think, addresses that question because in the work that Yao and I have done is imagining other ways of working, right? So the Caribbean is a place that is not known for nurturing. It has an extraordinarily traumatic history. A lot of violence. There's a slaughterhouse that literally sits below the soil of many bodies. And even though our governments are Black and Indian, it doesn't mean that they have shed the cloak of the colonial way of working. So, there are a lot of issues in terms of governance and leadership and structures and boards and committees and inefficiency and all of that. So we have both left the institution. I worked for the British Council, I left. We're both functioning independently and we're forming our own platforms. And those platforms are very consciously about nurturing. We are committed to the Caribbean. We have chosen to come back to and remain in the Caribbean. 1 or 2 generations before, if you're a creative person, you did not come back because there was no space for you. I think a lot about artists as orphans. And what we have tried to do is to create homes for people who feel that they have been abandoned. Because even there's so much richness, there's so many people producing incredible work as musicians and artists and writers and filmmakers, but we don't have the infrastructure to house all of that. And so the work we've been doing through Fresh Milk and ARC, and if maybe this is an opportunity to just do it and just like ring the bell when you need us to stop talking. But this is the commitment that we have, which is to working multi-generationally across all linguistic areas. So we work across the French, Spanish, Dutch, and English. The colonial project gave us a divided linguistic territory and made us think that we were separate, but we are not. And our work insists that we are a collective region. We have a lot that we share historically, and we insist on working across all linguistic divisions. So this is a map that Fresh Milk, an interactive map that Fresh Milk developed so that you could go in and you could look for educational institutions, museums, artist-led initiatives, and you could learn about the region. Because we've been mapped by other people for centuries, we're now mapping ourselves for ourselves so that we can understand how to move through our own space, and these resources are for us. So I think that the response to that is that you build your own spaces, you build your community, and I'm always being nurtured by the people that come after me. I'm mentored by the people that come after me. So we think about multi-generational, we think about gender, we think about language, and we also engage with the diaspora to some extent. So this is a map that Fresh Milk, an interactive map that Fresh Milk developed so that you could go in and you could look for educational institutions, museums, artist-led initiatives, and you could learn about the region. Because we've been mapped by other people for centuries, we're now mapping ourselves for ourselves so that we can understand how to move through our own space, and these resources are for us. So I think that the response to that is that you build your own spaces, you build your community, and I'm always being nurtured by the people that come after me. I'm mentored by the people that come after me. So we think about multi-generational, we think about gender, we think about language, and we also engage with the diaspora to some extent.